The building stood on a quiet street, one of those places people passed every day without ever really noticing. 5 floors, beige paint darkened by time, narrow balconies with identical railings. It wasn't old enough to be historic, nor new enough to feel safe. Just ordinary. Most of the residents had lived there for years. They nodded to each other in the mornings, complained about the elevator when it stalled, and collected their mail without conversation. Nothing unusual ever happened there. At least, that's what everyone believed. No one could later say exactly when the door became part of their routine. It didn't arrive one day. It had always been there. What changed was the attention it began to receive. The hallway on the ground floor was narrow and poorly lit. The lights were controlled by motion sensors that often failed, leaving long stretches in half-darkness. People usually crossed that space quickly, focused on the elevator or the stairs. The door was at the very end, where no one had a reason to stop. At first, it was just an assumption. The door was locked. Every building had one like it. Electrical room, old storage, something left behind by the original construction. No one tried to handle. No one felt the need to, until the night a resident came home later than usual. He noticed the door wasn't fully closed. The metal edge reflected a thin line of light from the hallway. It looked like a mistake, something forgotten. He stood there for a moment, keys still in his hand, listening. There were no sounds coming from inside, no hum of machines, no echo, just a heavy, padded silence. He pushed the door gently with his fingertips. It moved easily. No resistance, no lock clicking, just the dry sound of metal against old hinges. Inside, there was nothing he could see. The darkness seemed thick, absorbing the weak hallway light before it reached any surface. Uncomfortable with the feeling of standing there, he stepped back and let the door close on its own. It shut without force, without a latch. The next morning, someone else noticed the same thing. The door was closed, exactly as it should be, but when they tried the handle out of curiosity, it turned, unlocked. From then on, people began to notice patterns. The door was never open during the day. Never. But in the early mornings or late at night, it was sometimes slightly ajar. Never wide open. Always just enough to suggest someone had passed through and taken care to close it behind them. No one admitted to using it. No one claimed responsibility for it. And yet it was clear now. The door was part of the building's life. Quiet, present, and always inexplicably unlocked. Once the door became something people noticed, it began to affect the way they moved through the building. Residents slowed down near the end of the hallway. Some avoided looking at it directly. Others glanced quickly, checking whether it was closed, as if that information mattered. Small conversations started happening, always in low voices, usually near the mailboxes. Someone asked if the door had always been there. Another said yes, of course it had. But no one could remember what was behind it. A woman from the 3rd floor mentioned she had tried to prop it open once, using an old doorstop she kept in her purse. She said it didn't stay. She turned her back for less than a minute, and when she looked again, the door was closed. The doorstop was still on the floor, a few centimeters away, as if it had never been in place. The building manager was asked about it. He frowned, said it wasn't his responsibility. According to the building plans, there was no room there, just a structural wall. He promised to look into it. He never brought it up again. Then came the smells. Not strong enough to complain about, just faint, something metallic, something old. It appeared only at night, drifting through the hallway, and disappearing by morning. Soon after, the sounds began. Not every night, not even often. A soft, irregular noise, like fabric brushing against a wall, like someone moving carefully, trying not to be heard. It never lasted more than a few seconds, and it always stopped when someone stepped into the hallway. One resident swore the door was warm to the touch. Another said that was impossible. They argued briefly, then stopped talking about it altogether. The strangest part wasn't any single event. It was the agreement that formed without words. No one tried to handle anymore. No one stood too close. And when the door was slightly open, People passed by faster, eyes fixed ahead, pretending they hadn't seen it. The unease stopped being abstract once it began to follow people upstairs. It was no longer confined to the hallway or the ground floor. The door had settled into their thoughts, into the quiet moments when the building should have felt familiar. Residents started noticing changes in their routines. Doors were locked twice. Peepholes were checked before leaving. Elevators were avoided late at night, not because of the door itself, but because the ride down ended too close to it. Sleep became lighter. People woke up without knowing why, convinced they had heard something in the building. Footsteps where there shouldn't be any. A faint vibration traveling through the walls, like something heavy shifting its weight. One man from the second floor began taking the stairs instead of the elevator. He said it was exercise, but he always stopped one floor above the ground level listening before continuing. Another resident claimed she heard breathing when she passed the door. Slow, controlled, close enough to feel intentional. She didn't report it. She only told one neighbor, who never asked her about it again. The building felt smaller. Corridors seemed longer. Silence became dense, something that pressed against the ears. One night, the power went out for less than a minute. Emergency lights flickered on. In that brief, uneven glow, the door was visible from the stairwell. It was open wider than it had ever been. Not enough to reveal what was inside. Just enough to suggest depth, space, a continuation where there shouldn't be one. When the lights returned, the door was closed. The next day, no one mentioned the outage. No one asked questions. But several residents avoided the ground floor entirely, entering and leaving to the garage instead. Fear didn't arrive suddenly. It settled in. And once it did, it changed the way the building breathed. The first concrete explanation came by accident, not investigation. A delivery worker, unfamiliar with the building, took the wrong turn while looking for the service elevator. He stopped in front of the door, assumed it was a shortcut, and pushed it open without hesitation. He stepped inside, and then he stopped. Later, he would struggle to explain what he saw, not because it was strange or visible way, but because it didn't match any category he knew. It wasn't a room. It wasn't a corridor. It felt unfinished, like a space abandoned before being decided. Concrete walls too close together. The ceiling lower than expected. The air colder. Stale. He said the light from the hallway didn't behave normally in there. It didn't spread. It seemed to stop a few steps in, as if absorbed. He also said there were marks on the floor. Not footprints exactly. More like repeated scuffs, always in the same narrow path, leading deeper into the darkness. Someone called his name from the hallway. The sound startled him enough to make him step back. He didn't remember turning around, only finding himself outside again, the door already closing. The residents gathered later, drawn by fragments of the story. The delivery worker left quickly, visibly shaken, refusing to elaborate. That night, the building manager returned with old documents, not official plans, copies, notes, things that hadn't been filed properly. There was a reference to an auxiliary space, sealed decades earlier after a structural modification that was never completed. The text mentioned temporary access. No final approval. No follow-up. Nothing explained why the door still opened. Nothing explained why the space seemed used. And nothing explained the final handwritten line in the margin, added later in different ink. Do not lock. Ventilation required. After the documents surfaced, the door was discussed openly for first time, not in whispers, not in passing. People stood in the hallway and spoke in full sentences, as if clarity might bring relief. It didn't. Someone suggested sealing it permanently. Concrete, metal plates, anything. Another resident pointed out the handwritten note. Do not lock. No one knew who had written it. No one knew when. The building manager contacted the city. Inspections were promised, delayed, rescheduled. Weeks passed. In that time, the door changed its behavior. It stopped opening on its own. It was always closed now, unlocked. The smells faded. The sounds disappeared. Sleep slowly returned to normal. People began to believe the problem had resolved itself. Then the small inconveniences started. Condensation on the walls near the door. Paint bubbling. A constant, barely noticeable draft, even on windless nights. One morning, the manager arrived early with a locksmith. They intended to install a temporary lock, just until the inspection happened. Something symbolic. They never did. The locksmith stood in front of the open doorway, longer than necessary. He leaned forward slightly, listening. When the manager asked if everything was okay, the man stepped back too quickly and shook his head. He said the air pressure was wrong. Said it felt like opening a door on a moving train. Said he wouldn't touch it. That night, residents on the lower floors heard movement again. Not near the door. Below it, a slow, structural sound, like something adjusting. Making room. By morning, the door was closed. Unlocked. No new notes appeared. No further explanations were found. But the draft grew steadier, and people began to notice something else. Something subtle and impossible to confirm. The building felt taller than before. Not by sight, by presence. As if something inside it had finally stretched.